Tokenization for real-world assets.
They asked me to do this presentation in English. I'll just go back to here. We're going to talk about real-world asset tokenizations, which is using the blockchain to represent a real-world asset, like a house, a deed, insurance policy, equity in a firm, or so forth. My name is Alex Nascimento. I am most well known for teaching blockchain at UCLA, for any of those out here. And I've been in the industry since 2016. Very familiar faces here. And we've been focusing on researching how to do this from a regulated point of view. And that's my area of focus. So one of the things that I find it fascinating is that as people think about tokenizing real world assets, they also think about its disruption. And I like to use the metaphor about cloud computing. So about a few years ago, if you would tell a big company like a bank or even the CIA about cloud computing, they would say it's too new, right? It's too uncertain. It's not something that they would be prone. But we're seeing the same thing happen with real world assets. We're seeing banks, we're seeing large insurance firms, we're seeing large operators of trade finance, all tokenizing real world assets. And according to BCG, or the Boston Consulting Group, we see a few points that tokenization of real world assets is really going to address, right? You have a limited access to investors. So some of the biggest assets, some of the biggest yields in the markets are not available to investors. You have a lack of experience in wealth management from a lot of different players. You have assets that are restricted to a select group of clients, so like high-end art or collectible cars, and you have regulatory challenges, which we're going to cover in a panel here. So here are some of the numbers that we've been seeing that real-world tokenization moved from 30 billion to 150 billion, right? And although this liquidity is not huge, the market is getting a lot of attention. So on other researches that we've been following at the university, we see that by 2030, Citibank assumes that we're going to see about $4 to $5 trillion in tokenized real-world assets. And trade finance alone, for those of you who follow what's happening in China, we're going to see something around $1 trillion. For those of you not familiar with what's happening, I would highly suggest take a look at the One Belt, One Road initiative, or short for OBOR. It's a network of more than 60 countries, all operating real-world assets on a blockchain, utilizing digital currencies or digital assets for payments and transactions. So we foresee that we're going to see four major areas being tokenized. Debt, which particularly the firm I work for here in Sao Paulo does a lot of debt finance, and tokenizing those is our specialty. Real estate, we're going to see about $1.5 trillion. Private equity and venture capital, as well as other securities. And one of the interesting things that people might think about is, as a Brazilian, how do you get access to buy Apple stock or to buy other securities of, let's say, Uber or other firms out there? Continuing the research that we're seeing, we also see that some other areas of research point out to even more money being tokenized or more value. We're seeing numbers around $16 trillion, which is 3 times what the other research showed. But that's because we're including in those products that not essentially are financial products, such as policies or pensions or alternative investments. You also see a lot of home equity potentially being tokenized, and fleets of automobiles. We're seeing that the number of assets that can be tokenized, it's really endless, including patents. Some of the people that can come up, we're here in the Brazilian iGaming Summit, maybe you come up with a game and you can patent that game and tokenize it. Here is some of the growth we're seeing, and we're projecting that about 10% of global GDP will be tokenized by 2030. And we are breaking it on mainly listed equities. So you're potentially going to see a world of much more liquidity and access of investors to different equities. Case in point, if you're Brazilian, you're going to be able to buy tokenized stocks like Apple or Uber or Facebook that not necessarily you can find here on the local stock exchange. You unlisted equities or private firms, other types of equities, investment funds, a huge opportunity for being tokenized. Bonds, which is our specialty, or for those here familiar with the local market of precatórios. Precatórios are currently being tokenized, which was something that the average retail investor really didn't have access to prior to tokenization. We did a tokenization with a precatório already at Mercado Bitcoin and one at Foxbit. Thanks for the team at Foxbit for helping us out through the process. And we're seeing that you could see investors reaching at an average of 100 reais to have an exposure to a precatório, which previously was something that only a financial institution or a large enough investor could have access to. Home equity is also something we're foreseeing that it's going to take huge, massive adoption of tokenization and other obvious financial assets, including tokenized assets of various forms. But one of the areas that I find it fascinating that I would like to explore with you guys is tokenizing assets through the use of NFTs, right? Now, non-fungible tokens really play a very interesting part in tokenization of assets. Because, for example, you could tokenize a house or an apartment. Because it's a unique asset, you can use a non-fungible token to represent the ownership of that asset. And we're foreseeing that NFTs are going to represent around $230 billion worth of assets by 2030. And in the next 8 years, we're going to see a robust growth of about 33% compounded annually. Here, because we're in an iGaming summit, I put together this slide because it shows that obviously collectibles were the most active wallets, as we saw CryptoPunks and other types of NFTs being tokenized and sold in the market. But gaming has a huge potential of using NFTs to tokenize a real asset. So for example, if you are a very good Counter-Strike player or one of these other video games of point and shoot, you can tokenize a gun and you can sell that gun as an NFT to other players. But we're seeing metaverses very shy today, but with a huge potential, right? And utilities, NFTs that can represent the utilities such as a ticket to a soccer game or a concert ticket or even music. For those familiar with the band Kings of Leon, they tokenized an entire album and completely sold the album in a matter of hours. So to finalize here, I think a little bit of ahead of the time, I find that tokenization of real world assets, something that is covered by the famous Amaro's Law, which we tend to overestimate the effect and the impact of tokenization of real assets in the short term, but really underestimate it in the long term. So it's fascinating because we think that this is huge today. But if you really think about the implications of tokenizations of real world assets, we go back to this thesis that most assets in the world in a Web3 economy, will be tokenized. So last but not least, as we were developing the curriculum at UCLA about tokenized assets or security tokens, there wasn't really a textbook that would address that issue. So together with colleagues of the university, we wrote a book that you can find it on Amazon. It has more than 50 experts that contributed to it, and it would be a pleasure if you would take the time to read it. It's in form. And I would like to thank you. Here is my email. You can find me also on LinkedIn or on Instagram, and it will be a pleasure to continue this conversation offline, or if you have any questions about real-world assets, happy to address those. Thank you.